Wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Welcome to the first lecture of our series of lectures on Muslim world post-COVID-19. The objective of these lectures is to introduce different expertise from within the university and from outside on the urgent matters that need to be looked at and we need to think about. As we mentioned maybe before in other series, that these lectures is to raise questions and to provoke thinking rather than answering questions. So it will be very interesting for everybody to interact and to try to think about our future, which is very important these days. With us today is Professor Tansri Dr. Dzulkifli Abdul Razak, Director of International Islamic University, Malaysia. Of course, he has a very long CV, but he's quite well known. He has been in the higher education for all his life. He has been the Vice Chancellor of USM. He has been Vice Chancellor of Bukhari University. He has been the chairholder of the Islamic leadership in USIM. So, and also he is having many honorary doctorate from many universities, University of Nottingham and many other universities. And he has his own take on the future of the higher education in general and specifically also in the Muslim countries. So without further delay, I would like to invite Tansri to present his views and his philosophy about this, the future of the higher education in the Muslim world. Please, Tansri.
Thank you very much, Professor Waleed. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. I'm indeed very honored and grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for being given the chance to talk about something which I thought it is very close to my heart. And also, as mentioned by Prof. Waleed, is something which is provocative and controversial to look at what the future is all about, given the context of post-COVID-19. So I've chosen a topic on the future of the Muslim world post-COVID-19, decolonizing the Muslim minds. We've been talking about many things that's happening around the world, but mainly from a view of the West rather than the Islamic view. And I thought I will try to contextualize this from the Islamic worldview and how the Muslim society will respond to this whole idea of the COVID-19. Yeah. So if I can start with my first slide, just to show you the title, Decolonizing the Muslim Minds. I would like to start with this book, Educational Theory and Philosophy. It's a condensed way of looking what education is all about that presents, from my point of view, a kind of an educational dilemma. When we talk about education, it says here, it's a field sometimes beset by theories of the day and with an easy panaceas that overpromise the degree to which they can alleviate pressing educational problems. Certainly, I think we are at this period of time that we have been confronted with so many issues, the latest of which is COVID-19, and we do not know which direction that education will take moving into the future. But by looking at this, we suddenly find out that there are many options that we can take if you understand what the education theory is all about for the day and how we can move forward. Yeah. So I would venture to say that the theory of the day or the perception of education very much today is about the whole idea of ivory tower. An ivory tower is a concept of being elitist. Only a selected few can go depending on what the criteria, but the rest will probably be left out or move into another set of education system, which is probably not the same or sometimes be seen as inferior to the so-called ivory tower. So here's a cartoon, the people who is of colored will ask, is there an ebony theory too, tower too, for them to fit into this whole idea of what education will be in the future. So that will be one alternative at looking at it. And if you look at what ivory tower is all about, it says here, it's a culture fueled by privilege for the few, timidity and an air of untouchability by those who call the shots. Striving to keep the establishment functioning and flourishing are those who achieve but are not valued or rewarded for the loyalty nor for the accomplishment. So in other words, Ivory Tower will have its own understanding of what education is all about, geared to some sort of an idea that is promised only from the people who works in the Ivory Tower, not people from outside. So you begin to see there's a kind of dichotomy or a kind of a divide between what education is for the future or even for the time being, depending on where you are in this particular context, right? So there's some very simple understanding. It says here the meaning of Ivory Tower is a state of sheltered and unworldly intellectual isolation. And you can trace it back to the very early days when it is used also in a biblical context, as has been quoted here on Song of Solomon 7:4 in the King James Version, that talks about the Tower of Ivory in the context of the biblical context. So this is, I think, where we begin to understand what this Ivory Tower is. And I will go a little bit more to say there are also paintings and arts just to depict what Ivory Tower is. You can see here a kind of a notion of preaching or teaching to a group of people in a very selected way. I think the boundaries around you will tell you these are the people in the Ivory Tower. The one that's outside are people are not, related to the whole idea of what this privilege or the elitist way of looking at it. And this is a drawing that will come back again as we understand a little bit more about what this Ivory Tower is all about. Even then, I think as we go along, people are beginning to challenge this. I think this is another quote in the 19th century in a French sort of a documentation, which says that every member of society must be ever attentive to the social surrounding. He must avoid shutting himself up in his own peculiar character as a philosopher of his Ivory Tower. So in other words, not everybody understands or appreciate what Ivory Tower is. People think that sometimes you need to be, engaged with other people outside the Ivory Tower. And this is, I think, a kind of a reminder of where the dichotomy is and how do you then begin to interpret university as an alternative moving forward. Yeah. Now, when we talk about university today, I thought the idea of university today indirectly talks about this Ivory Tower. This I would mark it as the idea of what a Western university is all about. Going back to the 11th century, when you talk about the University of Bologna, which was established in 1088, and it was claimed to be the first university in the Western world. And the word university comes from the Latin word universitas, and that word universitas means specifically in the context of what they call the trustee of the European humanist tradition. In other words, university at that particular point in time, and in fact still now to some people, is the trustee of the European humanist tradition. Now, there's nothing wrong if you are in Europe and you understand this, but people who are non-European, people who are Asian, the Muslims, do we look at the university or do we look at ourselves as part of the trustee of the humanist tradition? This is something that all of us must decide and try to answer. Every tradition has got their own way of looking at things. Are we supposed to embrace this just because we want to be known as a university? In a way, to me, this is an Ivory Tower and a very elitist concept, and that is confined to just a group of people, a group of community, or a group of nation, that other people must subscribe to it because they want also to be part and parcel of this notion of what the university is all about. Bearing in mind that the European university is not the oldest university. Before that, there's this Islamic tradition with its own understanding of what center of education is all about. We call it Jamia, I think. And there are other traditions that have got other things. The academy used in the times of the Greeks and stuff like that, which have a different concept. But here is a concept that confines yourself very much into this whole idea of the trustees of the humanist tradition in the context of education in the 11th century onwards. That, I think, is the first point to bear in mind, and that, I think, is the picture that I was telling you. You can see again, the structure is very much an elitist structure, as the ivory tower. And interestingly enough, I think if you look at on the right hand side, there's somebody sleeping, the guy in blue. So in other words, sleeping in a classroom is something that is allowable as well. This is something that we see sometimes in our own classroom, where students are also taking a nap while you are giving a lecture. So I think this is the context that I want to bring in. Where do you start to understand this notion of university moving forward, looking at alternatives, and how do you make a difference when you are not part of that cultural tradition that allows us to take different dimension and different ways of looking at it. So this, to me, perhaps is already out of date when we talk about internationalization, globalization, and it is beyond just any one boundaries. And therefore, this idea of a trustee of a specific humanist tradition perhaps is something that we need to challenge and take on other dimension, which is more inclusive in this particular context. Yeah? Let's see what is it now. Now, if you try to understand the perspective of where this comes from, on the 11th century, you will have the University of Bologna as a kind of a marking point of where this concept of universitas comes in. Prior to that, we have got the tradition, the early tradition, the Sumerians and so on and so forth, and then culminating to the Greek, the Romans, yeah? And then we have the Islamic idea of a university, and then also we talk about the University of Bologna and the idea of universitas. Now, at that particular point, history defines what we call the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages for Northern Europe in particular, because they think that everything else around them is not flourishing, or knowledge is not proliferating in a bigger way, and therefore everything else just within the context of Europe. Beyond that, I think we have other developments. As they move on into the 15th century, we have the idea of a renaissance, all right? And that renaissance eventually gives to other development, technological development, particularly the context of industrial revolution, the first industrial revolution. Now we are talking about the fourth industrial revolution that makes up what we call the modern so-called civilized world. I want to go back to the word renaissance, which I think in French means rebirth. Rebirth of what? Rebirth, I think, is of the previous tradition that has been sort of dead. I mean, you can only get a rebirth if some tradition is dead. What is that tradition? Basically, it's the Greek and the Roman tradition. And therefore, the intention of the modern European university was to bring back all this tradition that was left behind by the Greeks and the Roman, and try to reassemble them in the notion of what the new universities in the modern times as far as Europe is concerned. Yeah. So on that note, I think we will see different development. For example, when we talk about the Renaissance, meaning to say that people are now beginning to look at the human capacity, human centricity, and understand that the human reason is perhaps the biggest thing that has happened. And they can probably rationalize, solve problems without any reference to anything which is non-rational, including religion, including spirituality, and all those things. Yeah. So from that, I think we get into what we call the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution, the second Industrial Revolution, that brings in technology that allows us to go into another phase, what we call the voyage of discovery. As people devise many other technological advances, particularly transportation, ship, and so on and so forth, then they begin to discover new areas. And this is where the concept of colonization comes in. With the technology that they've got, they begin to colonize certain countries and bringing in their values, and that values including the setting up of universities that is akin to what they understand from their own tradition, and this is where we are at the moment in time. Many of parts of the global south that's been colonized taking on the same idea of what a Western university look like. Right? At the same time, as we begin to focus on just humanity and humanism, we begin to push out or marginalize the whole idea of spirituality, consciousness, the thing that probably cannot be measured, although it is important in the human life, but it is put aside, and we move into something that is basically usable, what we call the utilitarianism, and something that we produce that can be used, can be can be sold in the marketplace. That becomes the preoccupation of university at that particular time, and in fact, indeed so. So these three ideas of the age of reason, the discovery, and also the humanism as a concept becomes embedded into the understanding of what a university is until today. And today, I think we really need to introspect and see whether this is a workable solution as we move into another realm of global challenges, including the crisis. The crisis wasn't apparent until very recently, when we see all sorts of disasters, all sorts of war, all sorts of collapse, that actually asked us a question whether is this the origin, or does it originate from the whole idea restricting to just a tradition of a particular community or a particular geographical boundary, as we talk about the trustees of the humanist tradition. Yeah, in fact, people are beginning to focus that there probably a second dark age that's coming along, and this is, I think, coming from a very important book. A very small book, I think, was published in 2014 by a scholar, Noemi Orakes, and another journalist, I think, Eric Conway, that talks about the second dark age has fallen on European civilization or Western civilization, in which denial and self-deception, rooted in the ideological fixation of the free market, disabled the world's powerful nation in the face of tragedy. This book was published in 2014. I said at that time the whole issue of climate change, the whole issue of global warming becomes a challenge, and some part of the world are not understanding this or still denying it. We thought it is a coincidence. It's not. When the COVID-19 comes in, the same nation seems to take the same position again as this particular magazine depicts. Yeah? They seem to be closing their eyes or blocking their ears, and they're not seeing the reality of it. And the title of the book is very interesting, The Collapse of the Western Civilization. And in fact, the author says before the end of the century, the year 2093, there will be a collapse of the Western civilization, as it were. I mean, this is a kind of development as you go to and trying to understand where the modern university is taking us on. Eventually, it will go into this if we are not careful of what we understand as far as the idea of university is concerned in the context of the ivory tower that I talked to you about. Yeah, indeed, it is so. If you see around the world today, there is an economic collapse, there's an ecological collapse, there's a social collapse, and there's also a geopolitical collapse. Everything now is in a mess. We are getting into a crisis after crisis, and we are almost at a tipping point, and this is where the notion of sustainable development becomes a keyword in trying to save this whole situation. But we are not able to save this situation until we get the foundation of the university right in the context of sustainable development moving forward into the year 2030. So the ivory tower, this is coming on from another very nice documentary produced by CNN and Columbia University that talks about the ivory tower. And you can see the picture on the left, the ivory tower now becomes a very expensive place to maintain. And therefore, the whole concept of ivory tower is now being questioned, I think being ripped apart, and we are not sure whether the university as an ivory tower will sustain itself over a period of time, or it will go into a collapse. Given the situation now with the COVID-19, I think the consensus is perhaps this model of an ivory tower is no longer tenable, and therefore we need to find what is an alternative to this. And this is where I think our position as Muslims need to go back to where we were and understand what education is and university is in our own tradition, as it were. I want to quickly move forward in what's happening, I think, very recently in the year 2015, where the University of Cape Town removed the statue of Cecil Rhodes. I think Cecil Rhodes, everybody understands that he's now one of the imperialists that go to Africa, create a country called Rhodesia, right? And he's seen as a kind of a promoter of slavery, a racist and imperialist at that particular time. And I think even today. And in 2015, there was a revolt in Africa particularly that removes his statue away, right? That is the episode 5 years ago, but that episode now has been revisited again when we talk about what's happening today. When you talk about Black Lives Matters, the whole idea of slavery, the whole idea of slave traders, the whole idea of imperialism has been questioned again. And the latest, I think, just about a couple of months ago, we see students in Oxford University are taking the same momentum and say Rhodes must fall because one of the colleges in Oxford is also associated with Cecil Rhodes. Yeah? So it says here, say, Rhodes, you are next. So it has happened before in Africa. Now it's happening again in London. The only difference is one is dominated by the blacks. This time here is dominated by the whites. But still, the issue of principle, no matter where we are, is the same. All right? This is what it is. The demonstration in Oxford. Campaigners are demanding the statue of the British imperialist Cecil Rhodes to be removed from Oxford University College and amidst growing anti-racism protests. Yeah? I extract this from Sky News just about a few weeks ago. Right? And now, then I think the Vice-Chancellor was trying to defend it and say, no, the statue must stay as part of history. But I think a number of professors counteracted her and say, no, this must go. And I think the council, if I'm not mistaken, has agreed to remove it after doing a kind of a meeting among themselves. Now, why is this important? I think one of the statements that the campaigner makes, I think, makes a lot of sense. According to her, a Western-centric curriculum, or university for that matter, excludes the knowledge of a majority of the world population. I think this is the crux of the issue. We are not against Western centricity as such, but if Western centricity is very idealistic, very ivory tower, and refuse to recognize that there are other body of knowledge around the world, then I think we are missing a point as far as university is concerned, as far as knowledge is concerned. I think that is the crux of the situation. It's not taking a position against racism per se, but us in the university must understand that knowledge must be embodied no matter where it comes from, because this is part and parcel of the search for the truth as far as university is concerned in its true meaning. Yeah? So taking from that, we begin to see also other dimensions coming on. Yeah? The COVID-19 somehow or other exposes the disproportionate impact on the blacks and also the Latinos. And why this is so, we begin to also see how they are now being discriminated so that they become, quote-unquote, a victim of a system that actually marginalize them, and to a certain extent also the kind of knowledge that is pervaded to them through the universities, to other education system as such. So the question mark now is beginning to arise whether the system of education based on the conventional model that we have is something that is perfect or something that we need to adopt without questioning. I think that is the question that everybody now is asking, and we Muslim also probably will want to ask the same question. Yeah? It is not only in the UK, even in the US, Princeton now is renaming the Woodrow Wilson School into the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, because Woodrow Wilson, although he's a president at one point, is known to be quote-unquote a racist, and this is one of the quotation that I thought was very blatant. Yeah, it says, the white men, aroused by a mere instinct of self-preservation, until at last there had sprung into an existence of the great Ku Klux Klan. You know, that is one of the most vicious white supremacist group in the US, a veritable empire of the South to protect the southern country. So these do not happen before, but because of the COVID-19, because of the Black Lives Matters campaign, suddenly people are discovering many of the universities in the West comes from slavery, comes from slave trades, even some of the very well-known university. And then the question, therefore, will this university be able to sustain itself if the tradition itself is coming from a very biased or a very racist sort of framework, and this is what I think the discussion will ensue from this, right? Now, while we think this is something which is new, but if you go back to history, during the times of Athens, for example, these are very nice frescoes drawn by Raphael in the 16th century, and these are the pictures of the intellectual during the days of the Athens, right? And if you see every one of them, they are Europeans. There's no non-European except for a guy, I'm not too sure whether you can see the guy on the far left that is tilting his head with a turban on his head. He is Ibn Rushd. Yeah. But Ibn Rushd in that particular context is not Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd then is Averroes. He has been given a European name, he has been given a Latin name, and for all intents and purposes, when he's there, he's no longer a Muslim, but more of a Latin, of a European origin. All right? Now, this picture tells us the same thing, that it is confined to a very specific group. So happen that they are Europeans, and these are the group of people that actually shape the world, the intellectual world, as it were. Right? There's another painting which is also very, very telling, called The Ambassador, painted by a Renaissance painter called Hans Holbein. Yeah, and if you look again at the painter, although it's called The Ambassador, but the two guys around him, most of the things that you see are coming from the Western tradition. The lute, what do you call, all the things that's on the desk are coming from different tradition which is non-Western in nature. In other words, they are acquainted with other tradition at the same time, but then refuse to recognize it. The fur comes from Persian, and all the other dressing also come from the Eastern tradition rather than the Western tradition. The tradition that they know, but they are not recognizing it. And this is, I think, very well spelled out in some of the writings that is what you call, that we will quote later, right? So I want to kind of summarize in the 15th century, when these three ideas of age of reason, the voice of discovery, and the humanism and utilitarianism becomes a core of what makes a university, we begin to see how these are translated. Yeah. So we talk about the rational mind when we talk about the age of reason. The age of discovery brings the whole idea of colonization when they visit some places and try to quote-unquote civilize the world, as it were. And this utilitarianism basically comes into a very mechanistic thing, looking at machines as part and parcel of how do you drive quote-unquote development moving forward. Now, these three words are very important to me because it changes all the time, but the fundamental principle, the fundamental ideas do not change, right? Let's see how this is done. Now, this is where we were. And if you try to look at what is the alternative story behind this. If you would know now that the Dark Ages is only for Northern Europe and not other part of the world, let us see what is behind this story. If you remove that, all right, what do we see? We see another tradition flourishing. The tradition of the Chinese, the tradition of the Indians, the tradition of the Muslim that is already there, running in parallel almost. While the Greek and the European tradition collapses, these other three traditions are not. They're still going in. And in fact, the idea of Renaissance become quote-unquote a little bit a misnomer, because nothing has died as far as the Chinese, Indian and the Muslim tradition is concerned, unlike the tradition of the Greeks and the Roman as such. And therefore a renaissance to us does not gel in, yeah, because nothing has died and nothing needs to be reborn as it were. So there is no, as far as we are concerned, no dark ages, because we have been flourishing. That's when the what you call the dynasty of the Umayyads, the Andalusian tradition begin to flourish at that particular time, and it is part and parcel of the tradition of knowledge globally. But again, as I've mentioned, it's not recognized because it is not European-centric in its nature, because it's not seen as a trustee of the European humanist tradition, and therefore it's just left out under some marginalization as such, right? Give you an example. Long before the University of Bologna, there's already a University of Karayin in Fez in 859, built by a lady called Fatima Al-Fitri, that builds the first functioning university until now, according to UNESCO. In fact, the first functioning university, as far as UNESCO is concerned, it is University of Karayin. Yeah. In fact, you move further, there is this Nalanda University, which is in India, Bihar, India, which is in the 5th century, even before the Karayin. But that university, I think, has somehow or other been destroyed, and we cannot be documenting it as a functional university. What I'm trying to tell you, basically, the picture of what a university is not a complete picture if you start only with the European tradition. You need to start with the tradition long before that, and this is the tradition that gives you different ideas, and therefore we begin to question, if there's a tradition, then do we need the age of reason? Yeah, we probably do not need the age of reason. And what is the difference between those tradition and the European tradition is this. The Western philosophical tradition has accustomed us to distinguishing, separating the mind from the body, the cognitive processes, the reason, from the emotion, which is the passion, even though it could be more appropriate to try to explore and understand the relationship that is emotional in nature of cognitive processes and cognitive nature in the emotional processes. Meaning to say, from our tradition, this separation do not exist. The age of reason alone do not exist. We seem to see this thing together, and for IIUM, this is very real. When you talk about the revealed knowledge in the human sciences, it is always intact. It remains as so. The only split comes in when we begin to look at the Western philosophical theory and the philosophical tradition that most of us has embraced it without even questioning whether the split is a legitimate split or not. And this university is making a difference as far as that is concerned. Yeah, these are the best testimony that I've gone through. When we talk about, they are intact with other non-European tradition, but refuse to recognize it. It's a book by Jack Goody. I think he's, if I'm not mistaken, the Professor Emeritus on sociology, I think. And he talks about this in his book, The Theft of History. The Theft of History tells us a highly influential critique of what he sees as a pervasive Eurocentric or Occidentalist bias of so much Western historical writing and the consequent theft by the West of the achievements of other cultures in the invention of notably democracy, capitalism, individualism, and love. So in other words, Jack Goody is telling us that there is already a legitimate idea of a non-Western tradition as far as knowledge is concerned, but mostly it is now taken over by Western writings and being left over or marginalized without giving it a due recognition as such. His book, I think, has been translated in Arab. Maybe our Arabian friends can also get hold of this book. Yeah. So until now, what I'm trying to say is basically we need to move from this idea of just the three things and how does this thing begin to move from time to time. At the 15th century, and then you go into the third industrial revolution, which is about the 1700s, 200 years later, the whole premise stays, but the terminology changed. rational mind now is called human capital, right? The colonialization now is called internationalization. That's why when we talk about internationalization in this university, I have my question mark. What is it that we mean in terms of internationalization? Is it a brand of colonialization that has been, kind of sugar-coated? And when we talk about machine, then we are talking about technology per se. Again, when you talk about the fourth industrial revolution, I have my own question whether is this the right thing that we need to do. So the terminology, as I said, changed, but the basic idea still remains, and I think this is the issue that we need to look at. So when we see the impact, the movement from what knowledge used to be to what it is now, we begin to see, from my point of view, these changes. The loss of wisdom and the rise of the logic of economics. Everything else in education now is about economics. We cannot run away from economics because that seems to be the new foundation of what education is all about. We lost the human person. We have created another name called the human capital. That is me and how do I serve in the context of the new slavery, as it were, to make the market work and to give everything else in terms of, the free market, as it were. Human well-being has moved out to financial well-being. You want to know whether somebody is happy or not, you will see how big is the house, how big is the car, how well-to-do he is, not him himself. But yet you see the poorest of the poor sometimes can be happier than the richest of the rich. And this is, I think, the notion that we are also now being saddled with, because we measure success now just through the financial well-being rather than human person. So we've lose the culture of humility to a culture of arrogance. I think university is well known for this. We always thumb our chest and say we are the best. We have lost the whole idea of humility as an educated person. And the result of this, they say the collapse of the ecosystem, it gets into something which is unsustainable. I think this will be the consequence that concerns me when we talk about modern university taking on from where it was in the context of the ivory tower, as it were. So the modern theory today, or the theory today, is now no longer the ivory tower per se, but what I call the human capital theory. This is something that I think it is important for us to realize, because we often use the word human capital in almost a naive way, thinking that it is just a terminology that describes another part or another way of looking at the human person or the human being. Yeah. That particular book that I quoted to you have a kind of a thesis on this, and I will just try and read the first paragraph of that particular essay that talks about, it says, throughout Western countries, education has recently been re-theorized under the human capital theory as primarily an economic device. There you are. So the logics of economics has now been embedded into this education that has been re-theorized. Human capital theory is the most influential economic theory of Western education, back to the whole idea of the European humanistic tradition, setting the framework of government policies since the early 1960s. It is seen increasingly as a key determinant of economic performance. We are coming back to the whole idea that university is here just to serve the economics, and that's about all that we know how to do or that we must do to be successful as an institution of higher education or school for that matter. Yeah? So it gives a rise to many things. That's now, university has been fashioned like a factory. Yeah? We work almost like a production house, producing a lot of graduates. Sometimes we do not know whether this graduate has got a meaning to the workplace or even to society itself. Yeah? So much so that some people begin to argue that higher education now is no longer higher education. Basically, it's a kind of a training house to upskill people just for the job market and so on and so forth. I think these are valid reason for us to understand, because again, this essay will talk about a key strategy in determining economic performance has been to employ a conception of individual as human capital and the various economic metaphors such as technological change, research, innovation, productivity, education, competitiveness. These are all metaphors that has got a lot of economic sense laden into it. Economic consideration per se in the past, however, have not been determined, determined education. So we begin to see the contrast when education was not part and parcel of economic consideration. Now it is almost entirely trying to serve the economic system, the marketplace, as it were, right? So now as we move on to the fourth industrial revolution, the meaning changes again. So we talk about human capital now in the context of artificial intelligence. Internationalization now has been technological globalization, that the sharing of knowledge and the 5Gs or the 4Gs, what have you. And finally, we talk about in the context of the cyber world. Everything now needs to be, quote unquote, within the cyber world, the virtual world. And that's why when we talk about this online learning and stuff like that, I also have my worry whether we are getting stuck into this ecosystem that finally it is beyond our control. So the logic is still the same, the terminology has changed, and some of us get confused as this transition happens almost very quickly, sometimes without consultation. Yeah? Now, when you talk about artificial intelligence, I think this is one of the finest quotes that I can think of from Stephen Hawking, who passed away a couple of years ago. And he says the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. It could take off on its own and redesign itself at an ever-increasing rate. Humans, who are limited to slow biological evolution, couldn't compete and would be superseded. And then it comes to what they call the emergence of what we call transhumanism, or the transhumanists, which to my mind perhaps another form of human capital 2.0 that works very much on technological dimension the way we see it today. So the whole cycle to me seems to repeat itself if you are not careful of where you are taking this on as far as education is concerned. Global equality became more apparent. This statistics from Oxfam in 2015, it says only 80 people, 80 richest people own the same wealth as 3.5 billion poorest in the world. All right, you can just put them in a small double-decker bus that can take 80 people. Now, in the year 2016, the number reduced to 62. Yeah, and 62 richest people having this equivalent to the 3.5 billion. Now, 2017, the number remains to just one digit. So in other words, given this kind of a system, the disparity keeps on increasing over time, and they are predicting from this curve, from a three-digit numbers of richest people going to a single-digit number, and it gets lower and lower and lower. Yeah, and for us in this part of the world, Asia Pacific particularly, where most countries are not in a good state, this kind of a division, this kind of a disparity gives a lot more burden for us to actually educate people when they are not well constructed as far as the distribution of wealth is concerned. So these are two basically major reasons why we need to relook again at what education is all about. Yeah? And I want to use the same cliche. When we want to fight the coronavirus, we say, let's flatten the curve. And I'm saying the same thing. Let's flatten the economic, educational curve so that people who have the same opportunity for education, very equitable, moving to justice and observing fairness as much as possible. And how do you translate this? My question is basically coming from the same idea. We need to reverse again the impact of the so-called modern education on us by going back to where it used to be. Let me see whether this will work. Okay. So from what is sustainable, unsustainable, we need to recreate the sustainable system. And that is why I think we are very gung-ho on the sustainable development. It's a way to reverse it. From the arrogance, we need to go back to the culture of humility where values becomes important. Yeah? Rather than talking about just financials, the KPI, we're going to go to the KIP, which is about the intangible. That's where the human person is all about. When you're talking about human capital, you need to go back to the complete human person, the fitrah and all that is embedded in that person in the context of education. The logic of economics must go back to the creation of wisdom. Rather, in other words, the search for this is basically what I call the search for the decolonizing education. We need to go back to what education used to be and moving all the other decolonizing factors on education so that we can come back to what education used to be and the system that is more equitable to everybody around the world, certainly within the Muslim Ummah, as it were. Right? Just a few more slides. Again, here it says that all this idea originated from the Wealth of Nation from Adam Smith, the science of human capital, the model human capital theory. All human behavior are based on economic self-interest of the individual. This is something which is very frightening, Prof. At the end of the day, I am interested only in my own economic well-being. I'm not interested in anything else. And this is almost contradictory to what we understand what Islam is all about, because we are supposed to work as an ummah, be interested in everybody rather than just the individual. So you can see the dichotomy, you can see the contradiction if you don't understand what the modern education is all about, given the kind of philosophy that IIUM has got. And it says here, other forms of behavior are excluded or treated as a distortion of the model. You can't even argue with them, because the moment you give another alternative, it says, no, this is a distortion of the model, this is an aberration, and we are not going to accept it. And so we are stuck with this whole idea of what education is all about, moving from where it was in the 11th century. I want to finish with this, looking at how then if we add in the other influences of education, not using just a Western-centric idea, but other culture at the same time, we begin to see certain things. Yeah? Here, when you talk about the age of reason, the human being and himself alone, we begin to add the awareness of God, being God-centric as a kind of a value system in education. We begin to look at the voyage of discovery as a voyage of self-discovery, right? And we begin to look at utilitarianism as a kind of a transcending over just things that we can use around us. And these are the three values that I thought we need to look at, removing this whole idea of Renaissance, Industrial Revolution, and so on and so forth, and bringing back what we see, a kind of a balance between the human and the environment within the education system, as it were. How do I translate this into here? There's an example. If this is the Dark Ages, the Muslim world is going on a very prolific sort of discovery, writing from Al-Razi right down to Al-Kuf. These are monumental work that the Muslim has produced during that so-called the Dark Ages. So we can safely say the Dark Ages is nothing to do with the Muslim scholarship or the Muslim endeavor for knowledge. We are moving right. It's just that most of us are not aware of what's going on because we have not been given this this exposure, as it were. I want to give a very specific example when you talk about Ibn Sina. Yeah, from the days of the Hippocrates right down to the first so-called Western physician that takes 1,000 years, but in between, if you are willing to recognize, for 500 years is dominated by the works of Ibn Sina at that particular time, right? And the last of that will be Osler, and this is what Osler said of Ibn Sina. Osler is the last of the Western physician. He says, describe Ibn Sina as the author of the most famous medical textbook ever written, that Ibn Sina's canon of medicine remains a medical Bible for a longer time than any work, right? It's quoting from one source. If I quote from another source, which comes from the Britannica. It says that Avicenna, as a practitioner, was the prototype of the successful physician who was at the same time statesman, teacher, philosopher, literary man. Yeah, so he's not just a physician; he's a whole complete person that we talk about when we talked about what the education system ought to be or ought to manifest itself. Yeah, his mobility as a scholar is documented in another writing called the Odyssey. And finally, I would want to just close by looking at this. Yeah. So if you go back to the non-Western system, the Islamic system, these are the characteristics of the Islamic system, which in contrast with the modern system as well. The learning system is broad-based. Today we talk about transdisciplinarity. We talk about multi-discipline. They are all polymath. They know not just one subject, they know many subjects, bringing from science right to humanities, religion, philosophy. Yeah, they are open access. There's no copyright at that time. It's all in a balanced way and presented. They are original thinkers, they are scholars, they are writers, they are competent translators. The very fact that there is a Western civilization is because the Muslim translators ably translated all the documents that was left by the Greek and the Roman into Arabic, and the Arabic, and then they was then translated into Latin that allows for the other civilization to flourish. They're very tolerant, they're very courageous, not unlike today. We tend to be very inward looking. Anything that's non-Muslim, we tend to discard it. They're very tolerant, they're very courageous because they know what their knowledge is all about. Global, international recognized. They're mobile, as you can see from the map of Ibn Sina just now. They're oriented by their mission. And that the mission is basically there is no victor but God, right? And Baitul Hikmah is perhaps another classical example. That could have been another model of university in modern times, right? So I would like to conclude now. Now we are settled in the fourth industrial revolution. What is the next move? Yeah? The next move for me is basically to begin to understand that we are also a spiritual being, that we need to go into God centricity, God awareness, using what I call the primordial intelligence, which is fundamentally our fitrah. We need to work on the fitrah so that we can get this value of God awareness as a natural part of our educated being. Yeah, we talk about the voice of self-discovering, understanding where we are in the cosmic sort of sense of the word, the microcosm, the macrocosm. How do we interact and bring the balance together? And we want to talk about how do we transcend ourselves, the oneness of the mind and the heart, which is the two seats of intellect that I think we should be able to recognize. Yeah? And this then will go into a cycle. As you transcend higher, your God awareness increased, and you then move into a better voice of self-discovery, and you transcend yourself even further. Yeah? At the end of the day, it creates this balance of what we are supposed to be as far as the human person from the Islamic dimension is concerned. So that is a cyclical way of trying to understand what education is moving forward, given the challenges that we have. Until and unless we get into this, we will not be able to solve the problem that is facing us today. I'd like to finish up by quoting the hadith of the Prophet. He says, wealth is not due to the plenty of money, but wealth is the wealth of the self. And I think the wealth of the self is what I'm trying to demonstrate just now as we move into the cyclical way from God awareness right back to the transcending of the self. And this is an evolution that we need to move. Confucius says almost something the same thing. He says learning is about being and not about having. Say another, who you are rather than what you have. But today learning is all about having, not being. We have big cars, we have big this and that, but we do not know who we are, and therefore the wealth of the self that the Prophet talks about is never translated in the educational framework, as it were. So on that note, I'll stop. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tansri, for this interesting and provoking presentation. on the decolonization of the Muslim mind. In fact, if you would like to summarize, I think there are few points that we need to point out in the presentation. Number one is this presentation or this lecture is an invitation to rethink about the higher education in general, not only in Muslim countries, not only in the Western countries, it's in general. It's a kind of a call for rescue the education, the higher education, in fact. I remember I attended a conference more than 10 years ago, and one of the speakers said that the higher education system is going to collapse exactly like the financial capitalist system. Yeah. And I think his statement is, seems to be true, So we need to relook into this part. Another point also, I think it was stressed very nicely in the lecture, is this is not East against the West, this is not West against the East. It's actually a call for reviving the traditions and trying to take benefit of these traditions. One of the interesting things in the history of the Islamic civilization, when Muslims started to look into, discover other places, the acknowledgement of the Indian tradition, the acknowledgement of the Chinese tradition, the acknowledgement of the Greek tradition, it was all melted into the new civilizational process. And maybe we need to rewrite again the famous book by Will Durant, History of the Story of Civilization, to reflect more a wider scope of civilization, not only the narrow scope of civilization, which is the Western civilization. So also it might be a call for rewriting the story of civilization in a different way. I think this is the right time now to rewrite this type of things. We can have a few questions. I think our followers on Google Meet and others, if we can entertain maybe a couple of questions, if there is any. So I will check if any have sent any questions related to it. We have one participant sent to me. He said, we need to have more of this lecture series. It's thought-provoking, so thank you very much for the comment. We'll try, inshallah, to have more and more of this type of lectures to incorporate people in this one. Another question I received, actually, it's about, it's a bit more specific. How we can transform something, for example, like the International Islamic University, to accommodate this new vision. So the question is more focused on some universities in the Muslim world. So they're asking Tansri, how do you see that we can transform our own universities into this new view? This is.
Alhamdulillah, I think as far as this university is concerned, the very fundamental of the university is already there. When we talk about the integration of knowledge between the revealed knowledge and the human sciences, when you talk about Rahmatan lil Alamin, in other words, like Professor Waleed said, there's no boundaries to this. We will embrace anything that is good within the understanding of what knowledge is all about. There's no need to say this tradition and that tradition. And Islam, I think, is known when they go to a particular place, they will embrace the values at the same time. We will keep the culture, we will keep the values. So I think the very fundamental of the university is there. The difficulty is that now how do you translate this in the context of quote-unquote success in the new world today? You know, for example, this is why we are not very, at least I am not very amicable to the whole idea of ranking. When you talk about ranking, we begin to pick and choose things that is not about the university. It's about something else that distort the whole understanding of what education is all about, understanding of what values is about, and understanding the whole mission of this university. So I think we need to be careful of these distractions, of people wanting us to be here and there, but indirectly or indirectly begin to go against the very principle or the very philosophy of the university. We need to recreate this. We need to rethink of how we want to move this university forward and get the distraction away from us. I think that's a big call, because the pressure of comparing IIUM with another university, for example, using another sort of criteria will probably destroy us, because if you are not careful of the kind of criteria that is used. So I am very optimistic that this university can go far, provided we understand where we are heading and how we're going to move without destroying the whole precepts of what IIUM is all about, given its mission statement, its philosophy, and also its vision moving forward.
I think because of the time constraint, we will stop here. Thank you very much, Tansri, for the lecture. It was a pleasure to have you, and thank you for our audience also who followed the presentation and the lecture online. And thank you for the feedback that we received. Inshallah, we hope we have more and more of you with us in the coming lectures during the coming few weeks, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.